What's going on, guys? Tosker here, and in this episode we are going to be learning relay and or delegate commands. Now, if you remember, I said relay commands are more like a universal feature. We can create a relay command class, and we can continue to use that for every command we create in our application. Instead of like in our previous episode where we had to create a specific class that implemented the iCommand interface to be able to execute a command. So in this tutorial, what we're basically going to do is we have a, if you want to follow along, a stack panel. I gave it, inside of a grid by the way, I gave it a width of 250 just so it's not obnoxiously large. We now have a combo box that's just empty, and two buttons, one that says MessageBox and one that says Console log. Now, essentially what we're going to do is we're going to have a string collection in our view model, and our combo box will display all the available messages, and we'll be able to show those messages in a MessageBox or log it in our console. And then we will have two special messages where one of each can only be submitted by either the message or console, but not both. So without further ado, let's get into creating our relay command class. So we're going to start off by going to add class, and we're going to call it relay command. And we're just going to add this to the root of our project for now. And we're going to make it a public class. And it will implement the iCommand interface. Remember, we got to hit Control period to enter in our system.windows.input namespace. Now we can go to show potential fixes and implement interface. And we have basically what we had before. However, in this situation, we are going to create an action like we did before, and also something new called a predicate. So we'll start off with the action, and to be kind of correct, because I expect some of you may be reusing this class we make, we're going to make the action a read-only. It'll be action with a parameter that takes object, and we'll call it _execute. And again, we're going to create a read-only, but this time a predicate, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. And we will have a parameter of object, and we will name this CanExecute. Next, we need to set up our constructors. We're going to have two in this situation, so ctor tab. And first things first is we're obviously going to need an action object. Whoops. And we will call this execute. And a predicate that takes object. And we will call this CanExecute. And to be kind of correct here, we're going to check first if our execute equals null, because I expect some of you will be, again, reusing this, so I kind of want to set it up a little more politically correct, for lack of a better term. And we're going to throw a new null reference exception, and obviously execute would be the reason that was thrown. Then we're going to get our _execute, set it to our parameter, and our _CanExecute, and set it to our, again, parameter. Next, because in all situations, maybe we're not going to always have to supply a predicate, because maybe some commands will be able to execute no matter what, and we won't really need to use the CanExecute. So in those cases, we're going to create another constructor, and in this we're going to obviously have to pass it an action. We'll call it execute, and then we're just going to call our base constructor, and we'll pass it the execute, but then supply a null for the predicate. And basically inside the constructor it will be empty. Now we're going to implement our event handler. So I'm actually going to copy this and move it down here below our second constructor, and we're going to give it opening and closing brackets. And here we're going to be using the command manager requery suggested. So we're going to call add to add to our event, and we'll call it command manager dot requery suggested, and I'll explain this in just a moment. And we will plus equal value, and then same remove command manager requery suggested minus equals value. And basically what the command manager requery suggested is doing for us is it's going to automatically on its own pick up on changes that could affect the outcome of our CanExecute. So things such as when we bind our command to a control, if the control has lost focus, it'll throw an event to CanExecute. Whether or not it's actually changed doesn't matter, so it's kind of inefficient in that way. But it'll just keep throwing it every time a possible change comes up, and if it changes, obviously it'll set the new CanExecute Boolean value. Now, one thing I have heard but haven't experienced myself is you can have trouble using the command manager requery suggested when doing asynchronous operations. So, just moving forward, now we're going to do our CanExecute method here, and here we're going to use a new operator. So we're going to do return CanExecute null. So we're going to check null and return true. So if CanExecute is null, it's going to return true, and that's because, like I said before, in certain situations we may not be using a predicate. So we'll simply, if it's null, we'll return true, which means it can execute. And if that is not the case, then we will simply call the CanExecute predicate, and it'll return the value that provides. Then we're going to move on to our execute, and literally nothing changes here. Just call execute, invoke parameter, and boom. So that's our RelayCommand class. We do have a few new things like predicate, which once we start implementing our view model will make a little more sense to you. And we've implemented our CanExecute changed event, and obviously our CanExecute. But overall it's not that different, but it's going to provide us with a lot more usage. That being said, now we're going to move on to creating our view model. So go over to our view models folder, class, and we will call it message view model, and add that to the folder. And we'll create a public class. And like I said, we're going to have a list of predetermined messages. So we're going to want to create a public observable collection. And an observable collection is essentially a WPF friendly generic list. So we need to add the collections.object model namespace. And like with lists, we need to give it a type, and this will be string. And we will simply call it my messages. We'll do a get and a private set. Next, we're going to create our two relay commands. So public relay command. One will be MessageBox command and get private set. One will be a console log command. I guess we can name it that. It's a good name, I guess. Private set. And now we move on to our constructor. And our constructor, now we're going to first off instantiate our observable collection so we can have our predetermined messages. So we're going to access my messages equals a new observable collection, and we'll just do opening and closing brackets. Don't forget the curly break. not the curly brace, the semicolon at the end. And now we're going to create our predetermined messages. One is going to be, I do strings, right? There we go. Hello world. The next is going to be, my name is Joe. Then we're going to do, I love learning commands. And then now we're going to do our special messages, and one will say, I'm a MessageBox. And one will say, I'm a console. So obviously, only our MessageBox will be able to say, I'm a MessageBox, and only our console will be able to say, I'm a console. And now that I look up, I have a little typo here for our console log command. There we go. And now before we instantiate our relay commands, we have to create some methods that they're going to encapsulate. So we're going to create first a public void called display in MessageBox, and this will receive an object. Notice now we're using an object and not a string. And that's because in our relay command we're using an object because we want it to be universal. But this means we're going to have to handle some casting on our view model's end, which I think is okay, especially given our circumstances right now. So it'll receive an object message. And like we did in the last video, we're going to add in our system.windows so we can use a MessageBox show. And here is where we'll simply cast our message object as a string. Next, we're going to create our public void display in console, and again, this is going to be implemented the exact same way our MessageBox is, and there could be a way to kind of abstract this and not have two separate methods for similar things, but for now, who cares? So we're going to again cast as a string our message object that we pass. So now we essentially could create our relay commands, but if you remember, we go back, we are also going to be determining our CanExecute. And we have our special messages. So in our view model, we're going to have to create a method that returns a Boolean value, and this is what we will use as our predicate. So we're going to create a public bool. And again, there are ways we could abstract this, but for teaching purposes, I'm going to kind of keep it a little messy because I think it's easier to follow if you're a beginner. So we'll do MessageBox can use. So this is going to determine whether or not the MessageBox can use this particular message, because again, we're using an object parameter because that's what we're passing, and our predicate and our action are both going to use whatever we pass through the parameters of our control. So here is where we're going to again cast a string for our message, and we're going to see if, since this is MessageBox can use, we're going to check if the message says I'm a console. Sorry if you guys hear cars in the background, can't help it, I live on a main road. But regardless, we're going to move forward and say return false. So if our message says I'm a console, then the MessageBox can use will return false, and we'll go down a line and just say return true, because if it doesn't hit this, then obviously whatever the message is, it can use. And we will copy, paste, we'll call this console can use, and we're going to do the same thing here, but say I'm a MessageBox. Now if you're following along, make sure everything is case sensitive. So in this case I have a capital I, the rest lowercase, and then the exclamation point at the end, otherwise it is not going to work. But now that we have our booleans that we can encapsulate, we are going to now create our MessageBox command equals a new relay command. obviously we're going to pass it our display in MessageBox, and then our MessageBox can use, and we will do the same for our console log command equals a new relay command. It'll be our display in console, and then our console can use. So here, like before, we're sending it a method that it's going to encapsulate into an action and store in our relay command. And we are also going to have our booleans here that will be encapsulated for our predicate parameter, and it will be used to determine whether or not our command can execute. So now we're going to move on to our main window and begin some binding. So first things first, in our main window is we want to go to our code behind, and always we want to make sure our data context is set to a new message view model. We'll have to enter in our namespace, so otherwise nothing will work. So now we can get back to binding, and here in our combo box we're going to have to bind its item source to our observable collection we created. So we'll access its item source, and we'll call binding my messages. So this will automatically populate the combo box with all the strings we provided. Next, we want to go to our button MessageBox, access its command property, binding, and I believe we called it MessageBox command. And then we're going to go down to our console and get its command property, binding console log command. And if you remember, if we're using a parameter from our combo box, we're going to have to be able to access the actual value that's selected, because unlike the last example, we don't have a property in here that we're just binding to and storing and then using. We're actually passing a parameter. So in order to access this combo box value, we need to give it a name, and we'll call it combo messages. And now we can go to our buttons and actually implement the command parameter, and we'll say binding, and as we did in the other video, element name combo messages, and we'll go to the path and we'll do the selected item. So whatever the selected item is, it's going to access that, and we are going to do the same down here. So let's copy, paste. So we got our commands being accessed, and it is passing the appropriate parameters, and we can fire up our application, and here it is. We got our messages, hello world, and I can do console log, and if you notice down here we see it displaying in our console. I can do my name is Joe and call the MessageBox button, and it'll do so, and I can log it in the console. And now if we go to our I'm a MessageBox, we'll see our console log button is no longer enabled, but we can still use the MessageBox, and vice versa. When we do I'm a console, we can log this to the console, but we cannot use our MessageBox. And that's because we are implementing the CanExecute in our relay command. And I could do I love learning commands, and they both will be enabled again. One last thing I actually want to point out is how useful it is actually implementing commands like this. Let's say, for example, we have our combo box, and not only if we put in another view, we could easily bind it right back to this these sources. But if I want to change combo box to, let's say, a list view now, and I'm just going to give it a predetermined height of 200. I guess 250 is a little big, and I give it a predetermined height. And now that's literally all I did. Now obviously I could change the name because it's no longer appropriate, but we'll keep it the same for now. And if I just wanted to change it to a list view and I hit start, notice now we still have everything still works, and even our message box, not our console obviously because we changed that, but even our CanExecute still works, and we can still log things to the message box and to the console, and it still works. So you can see how quick, how easy it makes it when you implement commands that you can just change things around without really affecting anything at all. So with that all being said, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Please subscribe, like, or comment, and as always there should be a survey in the bottom right corner of this screen or in the description that I ask you to take. It should take 20 seconds, and just let me know what you didn't like about this tutorial in particular. And again, subscribe and or don't, whatever. And I hope you at least found this video useful, and I will be doing more. Not sure exactly what I'll be doing more yet on the WPF, but I'm open to suggestions. So have a good one.